Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History Group. The views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker, the Farnham U3A World History Group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. The History Divide. In this talk, 5 speakers, Margaret Denyer, Alan Freeland, Andrew Cole, David Simpson and Richard Thomas, give their answers to the question, whilst the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 ended the Allies' war with Germany, did it lead to the outbreak of World War II in 1939? You decide.
We're going to ask David Simpson, who is going to do an introduction to the treaty. He's going to talk a little bit about the background, the peace conference in Paris that preceded it, and then into the treaty itself.
So, as the guns fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, thoughts turned to peace. But what sort of peace would satisfy both the vanquishers and the vanquished? What diplomatic machinations could deliver on the promise that the Great War would really be the war to end all wars? To answer that, we must go back to January 1918, when US President Woodrow Wilson outlined in a speech to Congress his principles for peace negotiations between the great powers. These principles became known as the 14 points. The first 5 points were the overarching principles that Wilson was endeavouring to introduce to the world stage. Firstly, open and transparent peace treaties, an end to the alliance system that had escalated into World War I. Secondly, absolute freedom of navigation of international waters, free trade, national disarmament to the lowest point of domestic safety, and for him, most importantly, an end to imperialism. Except, of course, America's own empire in the Philippines, Haiti, Hawaii, and Alaska. The rest of the 14 points were associated with territorial realignment and the policing of future areas of conflict. For example, Germany was to evacuate Russian territory, and all nations were to respect Russia's own development, as this was post the Russian Revolution. Belgium was to be evacuated by all the powers and restored to pre-war conditions. Germany was to evacuate all French territories and return Alsace-Lorraine, the territories Germany had taken after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. There was to be a readjustment of Italian borders, this time along the lines of nationality. Austro-Hungary was to be allowed to follow a path of self-development. Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, that forgotten quarter of the First World War, were also to be evacuated and restored to pre-war conditions. Turkey was to be recognised, and autonomous development for the rest of the Ottoman Empire had to be accepted. Poland was to be granted independence and granted access to the sea. And as I mentioned before about the end of imperialism, the most important one for Woodrow Wilson was the establishment of the League of Nations, the forerunner of today's United Nations. These 14 points were welcomed by the Allies as a starting point for any peace negotiations, and even Germany anticipated that the terms offered at the armistice in November 1918 would be based on those 14 points. In fact, contrary to German hopes, the armistice terms they were offered were brutal and humiliating. It rendered Germany indefensible should the Allies renew the attack, and constituted surrender, not just a cessation of hostilities. It was far from the anticipated package of terms that the Germans thought they would be offered, and it set the tone for the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. All the world seemed to converge on Paris between January and June 1919. There were delegates from all the Allied countries, diplomatic representatives from every continent, as well as future famous names such as Ho Chi Minh. But not all the world, in fact, did attend. Bolshevik Russia, and more importantly, the defeated nations, were not invited. This was to be a peace by imposition, not by negotiation. The Paris Peace Conference was probably the most complex that the world has ever seen. The war had toppled governments, humbled the mighty imperial powers. Russia had replaced brutal Tsarism with brutal Bolshevism. Austro-Hungary had vanished. The Ottoman Empire, the perennial sick man of Europe, had given its last death rattle. And Imperial Germany had become a republic. Old nations had disappeared. Older nations were reborn, while new nations were created. Discussion of the main peace terms were in the hands of just four men: British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, US President Thomas Woodrow Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando. They became known as the Big Four. In total, the Paris Peace Conference delivered 5 separate peace treaties in 13 months. They were the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria, the Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, and the Treaty of Sèvres with Turkey. So as you can see, the Paris Peace Conference was about a lot more than just the Treaty of Versailles. But that treaty has almost become a shorthand because it's the most well known, as it dealt specifically with the defeated Germany. So what were the goals of the Allies regarding the Treaty of Versailles? France wanted revenge by weakening Germany, in essence, to return Germany to its pre-Bismarckian weakness. Britain wanted to punish Germany, but with restraint, so as not to disrupt that holy grail of British foreign policy, a balance of power in Europe. The US had the most idealistic position, an end to imperialism and the creation of the League of Nations. There was much conflict and much discussion, but in the end, agreement was reached. And the main 5 provisions of the Treaty of Versailles were the establishment of the League of Nations, a reduction in German armed forces. Germany had to accept full and sole responsibility for the war, the so-called War Guilt Clause. Germany was also to pay the Allies a sizable sum in reparations, a figure not known even when the peace treaty was signed in 1919, but only determined by 1921. And finally, a reduction in German territories and colonies that would have far-reaching implications well beyond the borders of Europe. Now, the speakers in today's debates are going to look at 3 of these main provisions. So I'm going to quickly touch on the 2 that they're not covering. The reduction in German armed forces was designed to ensure that Germany could never again threaten offensive action. As we know, Germany found ways of overcoming these restrictions and had created a sizable military arm by 1936. However, despite what we may have believed, Germany remained short in several key areas of material. For example, it was not a mechanized force. It depended far more heavily on horsepower than almost any other army right the way through to 1945. It was also, despite the myth of blitzkrieg, short on tanks. It had far fewer than France, but used them far more effectively. In addition, Germany also had to accept the War Guilt Clause, a fact that many in Germany believed to be false. They pointed to the role of Russia, and in particular the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Sazonov, who put into action Russian mobilization plans that he well knew would trigger the French mobilization that could only possibly lead to a world war. The War Guilt provision, when coupled with the view that Germany's military had been stabbed in the back, was one of the reasons for the rise of Nazi Germany. However, in my view, neither the reduction in Germany's armed forces nor the War Guilt provision on its own can really be linked directly to the outbreak of World War II. I will now hand you over to the first of our speakers to address the core issues that may answer the question, did the Treaty of Versailles cause World War II?
Alan.
My focus is going to be on the broad effects of the Paris Peace Conference rather than just the specific details of the Treaty of Versailles, and I'll address the treaty's impact beyond Europe. I argue that the treaties implemented the Paris Peace Conference's wishes, and therefore you can't really critique the Treaty of Versailles without also critiquing the conference itself. So the conference and the treaties had an opportunity to bring to the end the age of empires. And the morality of empire was already being questioned by events such as the American and the French revolutions, and also by great intellectuals such as Voltaire and Rousseau. And of course, those people that were ruled by empires, by those distant masters, always questioned the morality of the concept of empire. So the Paris Peace Conference was the ideal opportunity to provide the world with a pathway to nationhood. By failing to provide that pathway, the conference and its treaties caused many of the evils of the 20th century. World War II could have been constrained to a small war with Germany. The rise of communist totalitarianism could have been prevented, as could the Korean and the Vietnam War. Britain's moral standing in the world plummeted. Britain, as the major world power at the time, must take the lion's share of responsibility. Three key problems faced the negotiators. One, as we've heard, President Wilson argued that the people's voices should be listened to. This approach was welcomed by the major players, despite the obvious implications that people never vote to be a colony. It was, of course, self-serving of President Wilson to argue this, as it weakened the European empires that the USA competed with. The second problem is that many promises were made, especially by the British, to countries and peoples in order to get their support during the war. Some of these promises were mutually exclusive, such as a country for Jews in the Middle East and self-determination for Arabs in the Middle East. Whatever was decided, some parties would be mightily aggrieved. The treaty resulted in Arab hostility and lack of trust towards Britain and France. Another example, to persuade Italy to join the war on the side of the Allies, the Secret Treaty of London, Britain, France, and Russia promised Italy a large chunk of Slovenia and the northern part of the Dalmatian coast, which is modern-day Croatia. This is not what the people of the region wanted, and Wilson in particular insisted that the region be run by Slavs, not by Italians. And many historians argue that Italy didn't do badly out of the Treaty of Versailles, but this is not how the Italians saw it, and Mussolini was able to use the fact that Italy didn't get all that it wanted to win popular support for his fascist government. This treaty was a significant factor leading to Italy siding with Germany in World War II. Similarly, many historians argue that Germany got off very lightly in the treaty, certainly much more likely than France was defeated in 1851, or when France was again defeated in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. But this didn't stop Hitler being able to use the treaty to demonstrate across Europe how badly Germany had been treated. The third problem was that World War I was indeed a world war, and countries and regions beyond Europe were involved that the European powers had very little knowledge of, and even poorer understanding of the ramifications of their decisions. The net is that prior to the Treaty of Versailles, democratic Europe was looked up to by non-European countries as a model for civilization. After the treaty, Europe was seen as self-serving, untrustworthy, and racist and discriminatory. So I argue that there would have been less conflict in the world, and Europe today would have a higher standing in the world if the Versailles Treaty hadn't happened. So here are 5 examples of how the decisions made at Versailles led directly to World War II being a world war. And that's the subtle distinction I'm going to make between did it prevent a war, a little local difficulty, versus did it prevent a world war. So during the war, Germany had control of China's Shandong province. Now, Shandong isn't just any old province of China. It is the heartland of Chinese identity. It's the birthplace of the Chinese nation. It's where Confucius was born and where he grew up. So for 2,000 years, Shandong had been unquestionably Chinese. Now, China had supported the Allies during World War I, so expected to be rewarded. China had provided us, Britain, 140,000 personnel to support our army. So China wanted its province back, but Japan wanted control of it as part of its campaign to conquer China. Now, the treaty awarded Shandong to Japan, and this led directly to the Second Japanese-Chinese War, which many historians argue is the real start for World War II. The treaty led to China's hatred of Europe and to America's support for the nationalist Chinese against the Japanese invasion. And this forced Mao Zedong and his peers to partner with Russia and adopt communism. This, to me, is the single biggest failing of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the reason why Japan was given Shandong was that Japan was one of the top three major powers at the time, and their support was needed to establish the League of Nations. However, the Japanese had been subject to racism by Western powers and wanted racial equality to be a founding tenet of the League of Nations. Wilson knew that the Americans were racist and would never agree to treat non-whites as equals. Japan was therefore given Shandong in return for dropping their demand for racial equality. I suspect Wilson also knew that Americans wouldn't agree to any power beyond the USA having influence over them, and therefore wouldn't agree to a meaningfully powerful League of Nations. And indeed, the USA didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles and didn't join the League of Nations. So it would have cost the major powers nothing to return Shandong to China. Instead, the Versailles Treaty told the world the West were white supremacists and forced non-white nations to seek military strength in order to have a world voice. The lack of racial equality clause in the League of Nations was one of the factors that caused Japan to side with Germany in World War II, thus extending the scope and duration of the war. Third example, Italy's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, supported by Britain, was directly against the Charter of the League of Nations set up by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, for goodness sake, Italy and Britain were two of the four most senior countries that set up the Charter. Clearly, treaties meant nothing to them. 4, the West views its cultural heritage as based on the Romans, the Greeks, and Christianity. This put the Islamic Ottomans at a disadvantage. Indeed, Lord George wanted rid of the Turks altogether and used the Greeks and Italians to try and conquer what we now call as Turkey. The Greek and Italian invasion of Turkey went against the Charter of the League of Nations that was being ratified by Britain at exactly the same time. And this attitude pushed Turkey to support the Germans in World War II, extending the scope and duration of the war. And lastly, we come to Russia. As we've heard, Russia weren't invited. Until the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire had ruled huge parts of Eastern Europe, and the Russian Empire had supported the Allies in much of World War I. Yet such a major power was given no voice in shaping the New World Order. By giving Russia no voice, we encouraged the Russians to adopt a military solution to shaping the world. The Russians created the Soviet Union by force, taking back control of the countries that made up the Russian Empire. Today, the West's challenges with Russia stem from the Versailles Peace Treaty. So in conclusion, Britain, as the dominant world power at the time, by trying to dictate how the world should be split into nations without regard to other people's interests, was bound to get it wrong. The treaty caused long-term resentment and hostility towards Britain and Europe. It reinforced military might as the way to resolve issues and directly led to many of the wars of the 20th century. Britain would have been far better off saying to the world, we're not going to dictate a new world order, or put in place a framework that builds on Wilson's 14-point plan, particularly point 5, giving people living in colonies a voice in deciding their future. And then we will assist these new nations to emerge and re-emerge. Isn't hindsight wonderful?
Andrew's going to go next.
I'm going to be covering the economics, so an apology to any economists in the room because this is going to be very brief. Whether the Treaty of Versailles was economically disastrous or not has divided economics opinion. And I've been asked to cover both sides of the equation, so my schizophrenia is being well served. I'll use numbers sparingly, focusing on their significance instead. Now, in previous wars, formal financial settlements called war indemnities had successfully worked. Reparations values have been set and monies paid. I think today's question from an economic side is in two parts. Were financial reparations so large that they put Germany in financial jeopardy? And then the second question is, in the years up to 1933, were other economic factors more important than the original compensation set in the treaty in causing Hitler's rise? On the first question, at treaty signing, no reparations sums were defined. It wasn't until 1921 the amount became clear. And there were many issues. The Allies disagreed on the size of the reparations and their construct. Should costs to defend against an aggressor be included? What represented damages, including loss of life, was repeatedly reworked. And to what extent was Germany culpable for the other Central Powers actions, particularly since most of those were now bankrupt? Various surveys and mechanisms were used to size the damages. Inevitably, this became inflated, bottom-up over-egging combined with a revenge surcharge. Nations argued for more money. Even Britain, with a relatively small damage costs, argued that it should have its money for pension compensation and won the argument. And the other issue was that Germany's ability to pay vexed the negotiators. Broadly, the Germans' economic position of pre-war 1913 was used as the benchmark. But parts of the German industry had been dismantled by the Allies and all their patents taken as part of the repayments. And a host of restrictions was placed on their future ability to trade. And despite Woodrow Wilson's insistence on the contrary, Germany's overseas territories were largely carved up amongst the European nations. The revenue loss was omitted from the ability for Germany to actually pay. Final reparation numbers were spun numbers. British, French, and German citizens were told the settlement was $33 billion, a high number, necessary for the public's placation. In today's terms, that's about $500 billion, about a sixth of our annual GDP. It would pay for our NHS for 3.5 years. German reaction to the settlement was complete outrage, amplified and exploited by its politicians of all persuasions, particularly those in the government that were earmarked. The reparations were defined as 3 bonds. The first 2 were for compensation and to end its liabilities, and they were compulsory, amounting to about 12.5 billion. And that's about 38% of German GDP at 1913, gross domestic product. Now, that was higher than the Franco-Prussian War indemnities, which were only 25%, but it was almost the same level as the Napoleonic War settlement, though the French had to pay for German fortifications as well. But the third bond was the largest bond, and at 20.5 billion. But this was more flexible and adjustable. Payment depended on how well the German economy performed. So the 3 bonds totaled $33 billion. That's about 100% of their GDP. Now, many countries today service these levels of debt, but most politicians recognise that the third bond would never actually be paid. The payment schedule required an annual payment of $2 billion plus 25% of Germany's exports. So if exports ran as the same as 1913, the compulsory part of the bonds would be paid off within 6 years and the whole sum within 13 years. And again, that's not that inconsistent with previous agreements. There were problems. The German home economy did recover, but not fast enough. And the forecast exports didn't materialise, partly due to the trade restrictions I talked about earlier. Quite importantly, the German currency fell in value significantly. So the USA, France, and Britain imposed import tariffs to avoid their home markets being flooded with German goods. Critically, there was no real incentive for German fiscal prudence. It was in great debt, and in fact, its exports were being taxed at 25%. So money that Germany made simply flowed abroad. So that's as it stood in 1921. The second question is, were there other economic factors in the next 12 years that were as important or more important in Hitler's rise to power? And I see this in 3 parts. Firstly, the reparations were actually lowered significantly, so it can be argued that they were less important. Various political and economic crises arose in Germany, and Germany regularly defaulted on its payments. There was a series of renegotiations. The 1924 Dawes Plan retained the total owed, but widened how Germany could pay and slowed down the rate of payments. And with new supervision, loans were made to Germany, particularly from Britain and the USA. But they carried on defaulting. And in 1928, Germany was near financial collapse, resulting in what's called the Young Plan. And it now reduced the total bill by 20% and slowed the payments even further, splitting into 1/3 compulsory and 2/3 that could be postponed, but they would have to pay interest charges. Now, this changed things significantly. The schedule of payments meant that Germany would not finish paying until 1988, and large Wall Street loans were made to Germany as part of the deal. So overall, of the theoretical 33 billion bill, Germany paid just 4.5 billion. between 1918 and 1932. And that's just 36% of the compulsory element and only represents 2% of their GDP in the period. Secondly, fiscal management. The Weimar Republic entered episodes of economic imprudence, and some would call it self-harm. GDP did grow for a 12-year period with some good industry development. But as a new democracy, it responded to public demands on welfare and infrastructure development, something it couldn't really afford. It borrowed heavily, adding more debts to already the loans they had. Its finances were always precarious. The most visible was the hyperinflation of 1923. The government excessively printed banknotes, prices ran out of control, and businesses and personal savings were wiped out. So a case could be made that the key German figures were either cavalier or saw their only way out was to take big risks. Underlying anger at the reparations fed into this thinking. Economic crises were a way to undermine payment demands. Thirdly, there were wider economic factors in the 12-year period. 3 really hurt Germany. The gold standard was introduced, had been very effective pre-war as a means of final guarantee of payments. Churchill introduced it back in 1925, other countries followed, and it really hurt the German economy because of the deflation. And trade barriers and protectionism got out of hand. It spiraled upwards with tit-for-tat actions from various countries. Again, Germany was to suffer particularly from that. And the last factor, the Great Depression and 1929 crash, was felt worldwide. But Germany took a double hit. It lost its exports, and then the US banks, who'd done so many loans, shut up shop and wouldn't give them any more money. And so the German economy collapsed again. So concluding choices, I think you could take one of 3 views. The treaty's reparation financial bill was inherently too big, trade restrictions too tight, reductions and reschedulings were just insufficient to prevent the slide into economic and political chaos. Or Germany could and should have paid up, just as France had done in the 2 previous treaties. Poor fiscal management and antagonism towards the treaty were actually the main problems. Or the Great Depression, the gold standard, and the trade barriers were the prime cause of the collapse into fascism, rather than the treaty itself. 3 choices, you can choose.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Margaret and Richard are going to present 2 sides of the League of Nations argument. Margaret's going to talk about the failures of the League of Nations, and then Richard is going to stalwartly hold up some defence of the League.
Right, the first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles were concerned with setting up the League of Nations. As was mentioned earlier, members would guarantee each other's independence and borders. They would bring disputes with other members or non-members before it for arbitration, would oversee disarmament, and would improve global welfare. Economic sanctions would be applied against any member who resorted to war. That member would then be excluded. Initially, 44 countries signed and joined, and the first meeting was on January the 16th, 1920. Members were at first restricted to those of the Allied countries, but there was always the expectation that others would join later. Articles 2 to 7 deal with how it would be run. There was to be an assembly. This was to deal with any matter related to the League or affecting the peace of the world, a very big undertaking. Each country of the League was to have 1 vote and not to have more than 3 representatives. There was also to be a council to consist of permanent representatives of the principal allied and associated powers, together with 4 other League countries, and these would rotate. Voting needed to be unanimous in both. In addition, there was a small secretariat to handle the paperwork, and Article 14 concerns the formation of a permanent court of international justice. The League did not have its own armed forces, so members of the League would be asked to enforce its resolutions, keep to its economic sanctions, or provide an army when needed. Article 8 recognised that the maintenance of peace required the reduction of national armaments to the lowest point consistent with national safety. The League formed a disarmament committee that was to arrange a conference to try to carry this out. Now, I have read through the rest of the treaty, but I won't, you'll be glad to be going through all of it. But it includes all sorts of things, including how Germany must de-arm and give detailed limitations, and it was forbidden to re-arm, form alliances with Austria, and invade or retake land. They'd also thought of a number of surreptitious ways in which the former might be disguised, such as using gun clubs for training, glider clubs which would teach flying training, and factories which surprisingly were actually producing weapons parts when they were supposed to have another purchase. But all these things that had been thought about did happen, and indeed started prior to Hitler's rise. And one can't help but wonder if reading the treaty actually sparked some of the ideas. So the League was set up with plenty of good ideas, and I really think there was the capacity for it to work and to stop a future war with Germany or indeed other wars. However, we know that Hitler did rise and World War II happened. So what went wrong then? Now, Woodrow Wilson and almost everyone else expected the USA to sign the treaty and to be one of the permanent members of the Council alongside UK, France and Japan. It was expected to be able to provide major support, either to apply sanctions or troops, etc. And as mentioned earlier, the first thing and a major thing that went wrong was that the USA didn't ever sign. So applying sanctions and troops would fall largely to the remainder, in particular France and Britain. The reason why USA didn't join was to do with the politics in that country, but I haven't got time to go into that. Now, this failure of USA to join severely weakened the position of the League, particularly as the articles intended them all to greatly reduce their own armies. So it's a conflict of interest really from the start, and that it didn't have the teeth to prevent what was to happen. Plenty of good work was done in various different areas, but the assemblies and councils were large and unwieldy, and decisions needed to be unanimous often meant that they moved very slowly and few decisions were taken. It was also said at the time by some British people that the quality of some of the delegates sent by countries was not of the highest. As I said earlier, it was expected from the start, and it was mentioned in Article 164, that Germany would join in due course. And Gustav Stresemann of the Weimar Republic of Germany was keen for that to happen. It was accepted in September 26 and actually became a permanent member on the Council of the League, having the power to veto decisions, which is a significant point. And the Soviet Union and various other countries joined, and some joined and then left again, with a maximum of 58 by 1934. Things looked to be going in the right direction for continued peace, but even this early on, the surreptitious practices of rearmament I mentioned earlier were taking place. The League didn't actually do anything to stop this. The disarmament conference started in February 1932 and involved League countries plus the USA, Soviet Union and various neutral countries, became known as the Geneva's Conference. Its main objectives including things such as defining whether something was an aggressively offensive weapon or a reasonably defensive weapon. It intended to abolish submarines, obviously that didn't happen, some aviation, heavy-duty tanks, and to limit land forces. It went on for a long time and they made some progress, but it didn't really ever do what it was supposed to do. There was some agreements, but it was actually unsuccessful in having the individual nations implement its terms. Individual countries were unwilling to make themselves vulnerable if they disarmed, and others did not. And different members had particular agendas. The French, for instance, felt very vulnerable being close to Germany and did not want to disarm without a guaranteed alliance if war broke out with Germany again. Hitler came to power in January 1933, and he believed that military superiority of Germany was an absolute necessity. As soon as he rose to power, he began to break many of the articles of the treaty and the objectives of the disarmament conference. He soon withdrew Germany from both. Hitler drew on the unwillingness of other countries to disarm as a justification that Germany should not be forced to do the same. The open process of rearmament began with the production of U-boats, tanks, planes, and reintroduction of conscription, so the army started getting larger again. And in 1938, Hitler forced an Anschluss, which is a union with Austria, and this was specifically forbidden by the treaty. He also threatened war if Germany was not allowed part of Czechoslovakia, where many Germans live. Now, he was able to get this land as a result of the Munich Pact, in which he said he would not invade further. Now, the League of Nations issued statements condemning Hitler's decision, but from what I've read, it appeared they did little else to penalise Germany, either by sanctions or indeed to use force. The main reason, as before, probably that it didn't have enough power, but also that member countries had their own concerns, and all were desperately trying to avoid another conflict with Germany. With regard to the League, measures were in place, and it was the role of the League of Nations to prevent such situations. Hitler did rearm and invade. One must agree that while perhaps not the only cause, the League of Nations did fail to stop Hitler. To conclude, the main reasons for failure that I think were important was the USA not joining. I think if they had been able to help with economic sanctions and troops, then it may have succeeded. If there had been a designated army of peacekeepers, etc., that would certainly have helped. I think that the organisation and personnel of the various committees and requirements for unanimous decisions was a factor. And I think it was very difficult for the League to act for the benefit of the whole with the differing needs of the individual members.
Thank you, Margaret. We have two more to follow. We have Richard, who's going to give the counter-argument to the League of Nations, and David is going to give us a summary.
Unfair criticism, since many of the forces causing the war were totally outside the control of the League. Many of the problems arising from the post-war settlement included dealing with, for example, the messy end of the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman empires, and these were dumped on the League to resolve. Later on, in the 1920s, the economic and political mismanagement by the great powers triggered the Great Depression, and this in turn helped, not quite the same as saying caused, the rise of populism and fascism in the 1930s and the emergence, as we know, of Hitler and Mussolini and the inevitable outbreak of World War II. Alan has made a number of wider geopolitical points about empire and the Chinese/Japanese problems, which we must not forget when saying, why didn't the League resolve this? Totally beyond its remit. The League was hobbled by the failure of the USA to join it, even though Woodrow Wilson, with his 14 noble principles, was one of its key architects. But if the Americans would not support his dream of democracy and world peace, why would others take it seriously? It would indeed be supported by the great powers only when it suited them. Now, there were a number of treaties at the end of the war, as has been said, and the patient work of the League did resolve some of the territorial disputes that were left over, but it could not possibly address all of the ones that remained. Nor could it settle things like debt issues. It couldn't restart credit and trade. It couldn't revitalize industries and act as a firefighter to deal with the many small wars and clashes which erupted. Now, not just because of the reasons given, inadequate support, no army, limited funds, but also, and I think even primarily, because there was no blueprint, no map to follow. Everything it did was new for the first time. It is arguable that it's amazing how much it managed to achieve. We also need to remember that during World War I, there were approximately 10 million military deaths, plus a similar number of civilian deaths. Then along came the Spanish flu, which led to the deaths of, figures are disputed, but possibly 50 million or even more people around the world. By late 1923, when things had to a degree settled down 3-4 years after the end of the war, trade had started to settle, food production had increased, business finance was back on track, and something approaching normal was happening. But even in that period, 4 million additional Europeans had died from local wars, ethnic disputes, starvation, often thanks to economic blockades caused by the treaty, or epidemics, what in normal times would have been preventable diseases. 4 million additional deaths, which you can more or less put down to the war. But what an inheritance. To expect the League to sort this out in a few years was naive in the extreme. But when you want to start rebuilding the world, you have to do it brick by brick. And if we look at the League through less naive and unrealistic lenses, we find it actually did achieve a good deal in its 26-year history. Thanks to its help, there were some minor territorial adjustments that were made. In 1924, it settled a dispute over Mosul between Turkey and Iraq. And it resolved the one you've all heard of, the Åland Island dispute between Finland and Sweden. However, more serious ones like the Danzig corridor proved to be more difficult and continued to fuel German resentment until World War II began. To blame the League for the failure to solve the Danzig corridor problem is not just naive, it's bonkers. It was perhaps more successful economically. It helped stabilize the currencies of Austria and Hungary in the 1920s, and in the medium term, the League Secretariat also helped revive the world economy. It arranged conferences on tariffs and conferences on trade arrangements. And I want to talk in a bit more depth about 3 things that I think we can say it had some real success. The first of these was the Nansen passports. After the war, many people in Europe were homeless and stateless, and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, became refugees. These included 800,000 expatriate Russians whose citizenship had been cancelled by the new government of Russia. And in July 1922, Fridtjof Hansen, a Norwegian diplomat, and rather randomly a famous polar explorer, proposed the idea of issuing special passports for these refugees. He very quickly became the League's High Commissioner for Refugees. And over the years, 450,000 refugees were issued with Nansen passports. And by 1942, they were still going and were recognized by 52 governments. After the war, the First War, the League also helped return 400,000 prisoners of war to their own countries. In 1938, the Office for Refugees was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts. Among the people who benefited from the Nansen passports were Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and Vladimir Nabokov, and, as it happens, Anna pavlova, the dancer. The Nansen passports also played a role in helping stateless Greeks who were in Turkey, and they were caught up by the foolish attempts in 1920-22 by Greece to ignore the peace treaty of Sèvres with Turkey and to reoccupy the once majority Greek areas in Turkey, such as Smyrna. The Greeks invaded, at first successfully. However, the Turkish commander was one Kemal Atatürk, and thanks to him, the Greeks were pushed, literally, into the sea in Smyrna. Among those who got a Nansen passport and managed just to escape was Aristotle Onassis. Why didn't the League do more to stop Greece? Part of the answer is that Britain supported Greece while France supported Turkey. Second major achievement was the establishment and development of the ILO, the International Labour Organization. It was begun by the League and handed over to the UN in 1946. It filled a real need, improving working conditions, especially for children, and seeking social as well as economic justice for workers. Its attempts to reduce sexual exploitation and virtual or indeed actual slavery was groundbreaking. It was also, in 1969, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So these are two major achievements. The mandate system. Following the war, the defeated countries had their colonies taken off them, and under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League, they were handed over to the victors, mainly Britain and France. They were to be managed not as colonies, but as mandates, in theory for the benefit of its native people. In Africa, Tanganyika was handed over to the British, and the territories of Togo and Cameroon were split between France and the UK. Rwanda-Burundi went to Belgium, and Southwest Africa was, thanks to General Smuts, taken over by South Africa. Most of these became UN trust territories in 1946, and all but Southwest Africa had a reasonably clear run to independence in the 1960s. I'm something of a student of the colonial period, and it is true that we, the British, ran Tanganyika differently from the way we ran next door Kenya. And it was assumed that our brief was to bring them to independence. Now, the various provinces of the Ottoman Empire outside what is now Turkey were given also to the British and the French to look after. They included Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. There was some oil about, and some people in the Jewish diaspora wanted to build a long-term home in Palestine, but the Arab Saudi heartland was mostly poor and sandy and very thinly populated. The British and French were happy to take responsibility for the area. What could possibly go wrong? Obviously, we could spend hours discussing problems in the Middle East, but my main point is that it is unfair to criticize the League for not predicting the Holocaust and for not realizing that the Middle East is basically a very large lake of oil. It is not the Middle East that has linked the League with the word failure, but their inability to stop the Italians from brutally invading Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, in 1935. Abyssinia was a member of the League of Nations, but this did not deter Italy. As Haile Selassie said in his address to the League, it is not merely the settlement of Italian aggression, it is the very existence of the League of Nations. It is the value of promises made to small states that their independence be respected and ensured. God and history will remember your judgment. Now, the Abyssinian crisis was a fatal blow for the League. The historian A.J.P. Taylor explains, the real death of the League was in 1935. One day it was a powerful body imposing sanctions. The next day it was an empty sham, everyone scuttling from it as quickly as possible. This is sad but true. It lost credibility and the ability to enforce its will. But it did not end as a burning wreck. In 1946, it managed to hand over to the UN not only the idea of cooperation between nations, but also well-tested rules of behavior, boring things like bureaucratic norms and structures, and operating procedures designed to facilitate cooperation. It also handed over a substantial amount of money and some rather grand buildings, including the Palais des Nations in Geneva. So in conclusion, the League of Nations deserves some praise and thanks for what it did achieve rather than criticism and sometimes ridicule for its failures. It is convenient to blame the League of Nations rather than the dishonesty of the great powers. And there is no doubt in the real world that any successes of the UN owes something to its predecessor.
David has now got the impossible job of attempting a summary.
So in terms of a summary of what we've heard this morning, in terms of the wider impact of the Paris Peace Conference, we heard from Alan around the impact that it had on China and Japan and also on Italy. What you see with all of these is a rise in militarism and fascism. It's undoubtedly the responsibility of the great powers in terms of what he failed to do and what he actually did deliver on. If we go back to Andrew's talk around the reparations, I think it's fascinating to see the difference in the numbers that are published. Those that are published externally, if you like, to show a damaging impact on Germany, as opposed to the numbers that were then given to Germany itself, which was slightly lower. And I'll come on and talk a little bit more about this later. The question, of course, as always, is, was it too harsh? Were the reparations too harsh? And I think we've heard from Andrew both sides of the story. I think he did a very good job of trying to square that circle, if you like. For me, I think Germany could have paid. It chose not to pay. And I think that there's a subtle difference between the two. If we look at the League of Nations, it was a fantastic first attempt at an intergovernmental organisation. There had been nothing like it before. So I think it was a great first attempt. It had its problems, it had its weaknesses. It certainly wasn't strong enough. I certainly think you need to point the finger perhaps at the Americans, who, having pushed to get the League of Nations, then completely backed out. And I also think, obviously, from a League of Nations point of view, one of their biggest failures was the failure to stop Germany from rearming. So that's my little summary of those. I'm going to come on and do a little bit more now around some of my own thoughts on the treaty. So did the Treaty of Versailles cause World War II? There's a question that's been asked repeatedly since 1939. The Paris Peace Conference, I think, tried to be fair, but had so many goals that it could never satisfy everyone's hopes. It had to make defeated countries pay without destroying them. It had to deliver European nationalistic dreams that were impossible in the melting pot of nationalities that were Central Europe. It had to handle the perceived threat of Bolshevism, with no idea whom it should negotiate during a bloody Russian civil war. It had no idea who was going to win. Finally, it had to replace that old world order that had destroyed itself in the cataclysm of war with a new world order based on democracy and reason. That was a tall order, and I think it handled it reasonably well. But it was far from perfect. The Paris Peace Conference pushed Russia to the sidelines, alienated the Chinese, dismissed the Arabs, failed to meet the aspirations of the Jews, created the breeding ground for fascism, and ultimately did not prevent another war. But did it cause the Second World War? It's always important to remember that the Treaty of Versailles was not a negotiated peace. The German politicians were not invited to negotiate. They were not consulted and were simply expected to accept the terms. We must always remember that David Lloyd George, during the war, stood in an election where one of the slogans were, "Hang the Kaiser." So the question is, were they treated too harshly? We need to put that in mind versus the actual emotions that were running at that time. But was Germany treated too harshly? It was very clear there had been soundings made, and Germany never wanted a peace talk until they knew they were clearly losing the war. The Germans complained about the impact on their economy, but Germany had treated Russia far more harshly in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that ended the Russian involvement in the First World War. In fact, Germany's biggest problem was the massive debt it had incurred for fighting the war rather than the reparations themselves. Recovery had been going reasonably well. It had received huge loans from the US. Its GDP was growing faster than Britain and France at the time. But I think what's more important than was the Treaty of Versailles too harsh on Germany is both the perception that it was and the political capital this gave the fascists. The Treaty of Versailles was the great bogeyman that Hitler used to convince the German people that they had been mistreated. The war guilt and the reparations were used by Hitler to show how Germany had been humiliated and economically ruined, when in fact Germany had been doing reasonably well during the mid-1920s. This perception of the treaty has continued to be the lens through which many, even in the 21st century, still view the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, while certainly containing elements that could have been written in the 19th century, was actually imbued with the new spirit of the 20th century. The League of Nations was at the forefront, not an afterthought, and was integral to many of the clauses. And I think the failings of the League ought to be put into the context of what I perceive as the gutless United Nations that we have today. It's become commonplace to blame everything that went wrong between 1920 and 1939 on the Treaty of Versailles. But at any stage between June 1919 and September 1939, political leaders, diplomats, soldiers, and voters could have gone a different way. I don't think it was preordained by any of the provisions that World War II was inevitable. Now, the Paris Peace Conference is not faultless. The peacemakers made many mistakes, and these caused resentment, especially through non-Europeans. While taking pains to create fair borders in Europe, elsewhere they handed out territories to suit the imperial powers. Now, in an alternative universe, it is possible that the Treaty of Versailles might have led to 100 years of peace. But for that to happen, several of the following, I think, needed to occur. If Germany had fought on in 1918, as it had done in 1945, and Allied troops had to take Berlin, then the Germans would have had to face the myth of the stab in the back. They would have to have known they had been militarily defeated, a fact that very many didn't accept. If the US had flexed its muscles and taken on the world's policeman's role, as it did after World War II, instead, as we've heard, the US sunk into isolationism. And I think what quite often is missed is that Britain and France were almost economically ruined by the First World War. They certainly had a massive impact on the weakening of their resolve. And if they had been stronger, they might have been able to forestall the rise of the fascist states and also the rise of the Soviet Union. And finally, I think something that Andrew's touched on, I don't think we can ever forget the real impact the Great Depression had on the Second World War. Without that Great Depression, I'm not certain Hitler would have come to power, because I think the economic impact was used dramatically by Hitler to create that opportunity for him. So there was much to approve of and much to regret in both the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. It's always easy with hindsight to say what should have been done, but always much harder to know of ways of doing it. Perhaps the best that can be said about the Paris Peace Conference is it may well have been the only peace that was possible in 1919.
Thank you very much, David. That was an amazing summary, given all of the views we've had today. I hope you found that very thought-provoking.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.